All right, so basically this is a follow-on session, but you didn't necessarily need to be in the earlier session. In the first session, I didn't really focus on the technical details. What I did was I went through using some new tooling, some beta tooling, if you like, for creating pages dynamically and persisting them to the repository and then rendering them without any server starts. And I was kind of just showcasing the new share widget library which we have. And this session is going to be talking about that. And in particular, it's going to be talking about the technical details of how it works. So this is much more of a technical session than the previous one. I'm also going to do a few little bits of my typical housekeeping items that I do relating to share development. So I'm going to do a very, very quick recap, quick point of how we got where we are. So originally we had Alfresco Surf, which was used in Share 3 to 3.2. Before that, Share was a new web client at that point, because before that we were using the Explorer client, which is still available for use if people want to use it. And then we donated, or we made Surf an extension, a full class extension of Spring MVC, and it became Spring Source, which was first used in 3.3. I joined the company around about the 4.0 time frame, and we set about trying to make Share much more extensible, so we added a whole load of new features into 4.0. 4.1 we added some dynamic configuration stuff, and then the big thing we did before DevCon last year was we did a big refactor of Share, trying to make all of the web scripts much more consistent and moving all of the logic out of the templates and into the controller, trying to make things much more easier to extend. So I'm not going to go over any of that stuff because it's all, again, up on YouTube. If you like to watch that back, I go into all the details of the customization, and the majority of which still holds true. It's all true, but there's some sort of additional bits, really, that I'm going to be talking about in this session. So another thing that comes up every time we have a conference, and I always give a different answer, is the annual Spring Surf question. What's going to happen with Spring Surf? 2 years ago, I said, no, we're just going to leave Surf where it is. We're not going to do anything with it. And then last year I said, well, actually what we're going to do is we're going to bring it back, but we're going to leave all the class names the same. Interestingly, earlier this year, Spring Source took it out of our hands because they said they were doing a big spring clean, if you like, of their repositories and their extensions. And they felt there wasn't any traction really on Surf, which is true. It's only really developed and used by Alfresco. And they said, would we take it off their hands effectively? So we took a clone of the SVN repository and we brought it into the Alfresco SVN. I believe the Spring Source SVN is still up there in read-only mode. And at the moment we've got Surf in Alfresco. And the disadvantage for the community at the moment is that it's private, so you can't actually see the check-ins we're making. And what we're likely to do, there's no guarantees of this, or there's no time frame for this, because Surf is Maven build and Alfresco, although we're moving to a Maven build, it is still primarily an Ant build. There's no point in us converting Surf to be Ant only for it to move back again. So what we're going to most likely do is we're going to wait until Alfresco goes to a full Maven build, and then we will branch Surf, because up until now we've basically been using snapshots of Surf deployed into Alfresco, but then we'll do a proper branch and we'll start tying Surf back into the proper release stream for Alfresco, and then it will go back into the public community, so you'll then be able to see it again. But the same thing holds true, as I said last year. We won't change any package names because it makes no sense. All it'll do is make things harder for everyone. So it'll still be whatever it is, org, Spring, Framework, whatever it is, extensions, whatever. So we're going to keep it all the same, but that's kind of where we are. So as I said, the disadvantage for you guys at the moment is that it's private and you can't see the check-ins. Obviously, you'll be able to see the snapshots, or as we are still using them, from the nightly builds and what's going into the community SVN trunk. But that's kind of where we are with Surf at the moment. So why are we changing? Because this is kind of the gist of this talk. Is, I mean, what are we doing that's going to be different? So, or why do we want to make these changes? So there's a number of drivers for this. One of the main ones is that UE2 is no longer being developed. Share was originally built around the UE2 JavaScript framework. It's not been developed for quite a while now. There's no easy migration path to UE3. Even if there was, it might not be in our interests to use it. And as I was kind of covering in quite great detail in the earlier session, creating pages in Share is just too hard. We need to make it easier for people to build their own pages and work with the pages that we provide. And another big driver is accessibility. This is becoming a very hot issue for us as we get more and more deals in government. Governments are mandating that applications need to be accessible. By accessible, I mean navigation via screen readers and keyboard navigation, things like that, so for visibility impaired users. So we need to, in a Share at the moment isn't terrible as far as an accessible application is concerned, but it has room for improvement. So we need to start thinking about how we make widgets that are fully accessible. And we're looking at things like performance, reduction in HTTP requests. We want to improve reusability for ourselves as much as anything else, because we need to work smarter, if you like to use a cliche term. We need to make widgets that are smaller that we can reuse without having to constantly reinvent the wheel. And obviously, as the sort of continuing theme, we want to make customization easier. Share is very much a platform, and we want to make it easier for you to take what we have and customize it to your own particular needs. So, what is it that's actually changed? What is it that I'm going to be talking about? So, simple page creation is one of the primary things. We want to retain the power of Surf, but we want to sort of hide some of those features away. We want to make it much easier for people to create pages, and we want to be able to do that by defining pages as single web scripts rather than carrying all the baggage of all those Surf objects that people had to write previously. And in doing that, we've had to build an entire new dynamic analysis engine for analyzing these page models that we're going to be creating and churning them out into the resources that we actually want, and actually aggregated and minified resources, doing all that on the fly. And leveraging this framework that's gone into Surf, we've got this brand new widget library. And there's also, we're putting in some new customization tools, and there'll be more of those along the way. So here it is. We've got this new widget library. That's what I'm going to be talking about. We've got over 100 new widgets. Now, most of those, as I said earlier, should be considered very much beta. The caveat to that is if any of the widgets are used out of the box in Share 4.2, then they are obviously production ready because they are in a production piece of software. However, we've made the library fully available in the community, even though it's sort of work in progress, so that you guys can get an idea of where we're going and use it as samples and things like that. But I would say that you want to be careful about relying on these things from a migration point of view going forwards, because if it's not used in the product at the moment, we're not guaranteeing that the APIs change, functions might change, the widgets might be changed completely. So that's kind of a caveat, but we want to sort of share with you the direction we're heading in, so you kind of get an idea of what we're going to be doing, and also so you guys can start using this framework yourselves. And these widgets that we're writing are going to be used for all new Share features going forwards. So we're not rewriting Share, we're going to be starting to migrate towards this way of developing. But all of the old features are going to remain in place. We're not just going to do a complete rewrite of Share. And as I said at the end in the Q&A of the last session, it's not something that's going to happen overnight, because there isn't the time, there aren't the resources to do that kind of stuff. So let's define exactly what we're calling a widget. So a massively overloaded concept. So most people would think of a widget as being just a JavaScript object. That's certainly how the UE2 widgets are. We want to bring in a little bit more than that. We want to have include HTML in that. Again, some widget libraries do that as well. Dojo, for example, has the HTML DOM fragment is sort of baked into the widget. But again, we want to take it further than that. We also want to include the styling for a widget. We want to have all the CSS that is related to that widget included with the definition for that widget. And finally, we want to include all of the localization for that widget. So what we're trying to get to is we're trying to encapsulate everything. We want to have an atomic entity that we can reference in a page model, and by referencing it, we get all of the resources we need, and also more than that, we get only the resources we need. So if you're using other frameworks, typically what you might do is you might say you pull in their entire CSS library. You might be using one of their widgets, but you might end up pulling in a whole bunch of CSS that you don't need. There's obviously some overhead to that, probably not a massive overhead, but there is some. Obviously that's not true for all cases. You can custom build your CSS in jQuery, things like that. But this is what we want to try and get to. We want to make a single atomic entity. And the other key thing about this is we want to make our widgets smaller. Up until now, our client-side widgets have been really coarse. So I'm going to give you an example of this. This is the current document library as it stands today. And what I've drawn, the red boxes around it represent the widgets that there are. So there's 6 widgets. You've got like the filters, the tree, 7 I think there is actually, 6 I don't know. The categories, tags, and we've got the massive one is the document list, which is probably the widget you probably want to do the most with, and it's the hardest to actually do anything with because it's just one big coarse thing. You drop it onto the page and it's there. And we tried to make it easier in 4.2c by moving this refactor so that you could much more easily extend the Java, that widget, and then override some functions. But it wasn't an ideal solution. So this is a beta of the new document library. Basically, it's sort of we're aiming for feature parity here initially, but these are the widgets marked. In fact, it's not even all of the widgets because, quite frankly, I got a bit bored of drawing red boxes on a screen. But this should hopefully visually indicate the kind of granularity we're going to. And the reason we want to do this is because there's a lot of we reproduce lots of things. Even just from the document details page in itself, we have the social stuffs there, the folders, thumbnails, all of that stuff's still there, but we've actually ended up rewriting it. So by making it easier to reuse widgets, we're doing ourselves lots of favors in that we are, it's less to maintain, introduces consistency, we change it in one place, it moves across the place. So this is kind of our goal, make smaller atomic entities that we can just start building things up from and not have to constantly create these big sort of monolithic JavaScript widgets. And we're going to use these in page models. And so if you at the earlier session, you'll have seen how I was defining JSON structures which reference these widgets, and they're all done in a particular structure, which I'm a bit pattern, which I'm going to get onto. So here's an example. We saw some of this kind of thing here when I was showing the videos of the JSON editor. So it's a very simple page structure. We've got a layout widget, which in this case is a left and right layout, effectively kind of allowing you to sort of float widgets left and right as the child widgets, and within that we're putting a logo, and that logo is floated to the right. So just to break that down, within a widget definition or widget fragment of JSON, we specify the name, which is the thing we want to instantiate, and we have a config attribute which defines the instantiation arguments for that object. And then now this is a bit of the thing that sort of crept in, and it's sort of point of confusion, and we recognize it's a point of confusion. There are 2 ID attributes. The ID attribute that is a peer of the name is purely the identifier of that piece of the model, and that is only used when you're doing extensions. So if you want to reference something that's in a default model and change it, that's the ID you use. And then the ID that is inside the config is actually ultimately going to become the ID in the final DOM fragment, or the final generated DOM in the page. And we actually didn't want to use this originally. We wanted to have sort of IDs generated, but our QA team started writing these automated tests, and they started complaining, and they needed to have specific IDs, so we started adding this in so it would be used. Other things you can do is you can use this assigned to variable. That basically, although I talked about decoupling, and that's something we're trying to stick to. We want to decouple peer widgets, but there is a case for a parent having references to its children, particularly for things like keyboard navigation. You want to be able to reference its children so you can step through those widgets. So that's how you can do that purely through this assignment config. You can do things like, and so this is when you're defining the configuration, you either have attributes that are, again, peers of the config, and that means it's used by the enclosing widget. So in this case, the align attribute is being used by the left and right widget to so it knows where to place the widget, and the logo class attribute is being used by the logo class itself. So that's kind of how this kind of stuff works. So I appreciate it's a little bit to take in straight away, but hopefully as you start to use these and as we improve the tooling, it'll be easier to build these models up. Okay, and so what we're going to do is we want to define pages a single web script. So we want to completely reduce the overhead of defining a page. And And what we're going to have is we're going to have our descriptor, because you have to have a descriptor for a web script. We're going to have our JavaScript controller, which is where we place the model. And we're going to have, you can have localization properties if you want. As I said, you can define localization properties as part of the widget. You can still have localization properties as part of the web script that is instantiating that page model, and there are still global localization properties. And effectively what happens is the most specific wins. So if you have the same localization key globally within the web script and also in the widget one is going to be the one that wins because it is the most specific localization. So that's how that's going to work. And then what this does is it means we get the following. We now get our page XML as we had sort of before, and then we have our template XML, and we actually have a number of these that we're able to switch between, which I'm going to demonstrate in a little bit. The key difference here is that we're actually going to have a web script template. So again, when I was talking about the strength of things that you can do with Surf, we've just had a pattern of having a template XML go to a vanilla free marker template, but we're actually moving this to a web script because that gives us that much more power. What it enables us to do is it enables us to strip off URL tokens from the URL you're using, identify if you want to grab, you want to use an actual web script with a model or like a repository model or anything else you decide to use, and it can dynamically create the component to bind that web script into. So it sort of takes away a lot of the effort that you have to use. And so as I said, we've got a few of these page models and templates, but you can obviously create your own or just use the ones that we're providing. And it works using this concept of URL tokens. URL tokens have been around in Surf, I think, since as long as I've known Surf and Share. And typically the classic example you'll see when you're using Share now is if you go to a site, you might go to a site called Site1. The location you'll go to is like page/site/site1/document library. The page you're always going to is just called document library. It's the page ID, but it's mapped to a URL, and Site1 is then picked up so it knows what data to retrieve. So we are using this same approach. Here's a couple of the very simple examples. The top one is matching to a particular web script. So you'll have seen me using this when I was using the JSON editor and the page creation tool. And the bottom one is matching to a particular page name. So the page ID is the bit that we're going to stick in to identify the page. The thing that differentiates them is whether if it's WS for web script or P for page or remote page. And then we strip off the URL, the last bit of the URL token, to say, okay, this is actually what we want to process. We're using this web script, we're using this remote page. So here's an example. So this is accessing a remote page. You can see the share/page hits the Spring MVC request dispatcher. RP in this case is saying I want a remote page. P is the thing that matches it to the particular URL token. Logo page is the name of the page model I want to use, and that's what loads the page. We've also got this notion, as I was showing, of a hybrid page. So it's actually HRP, very subtle difference there, H just going in there. And what's happening is we're taking the standard header and footer components and we're injecting our page data in between it. So you could do something very similar if you wanted to make your pages. You could define your own template and just use this a little part of it. You can use this just for specific components in the same way that we're using this model just for the header at the moment. There's lots of flexibility there for you to play with. So how does this all work? So what we're trying to get to is the notion that a web script is a module, and we're using a concept called Asynchronous Module Definition. And you don't have to read all of this. Basically, the gist of it is that a module can define a set of dependencies on the things that it refers to. And the important bit is that having defined all of these dependencies, you're able to build and minify a single JavaScript resource layer. Now, most frameworks where this occurs, you do this as a build step before deployment. You basically run it through a build, work out all of the dependencies, and then you create a build layer and you use that for that particular page. What Surf does is actually does all of this on the fly. So you give it a page model, it works out what it needs. Not only does it analyze the dependencies, but it will also minify the files for you, does all sorts of other cool stuff. And all the work is done in this custom free marker directive called ProcessJsonModel. Now, when you define a page model web script, this is literally the only thing that you need in your template. You don't need anything else. You can put other stuff in there if you want to, but you use this, and what it does is it looks for a specific entry in your JavaScript controller, takes that JSON model, and then it turns it into the resources you need. So here we have Surf running its ProcessJsonModel custom directive, and we're going to inject a page model into it. And what we do is Surf will do a number of things. The first thing it will do is actually look through the JSON structure itself, and it looks for those name attributes within that sort of repeating pattern. Each name maps to a module. It can then identify that model as a dependency, go and get that JavaScript resource, analyze the content, work out all of the things it needs. So the things it's going to do is it's going to build a bootstrap JavaScript resource, if you like, and this will include all the localization properties. That will become one JavaScript page, a JavaScript resource, and that bootstrap will then want to reference all of the other dependencies on the page, and these will be built as a secondary JavaScript model, and that will include all of the HTML fragments that are required for those widgets. And finally, it will build a single CSS resource. And these can, and in fact do for 4.2 Enterprise, include all the images that are referenced in CSS. It will take those images and it will base64 encode them directly into the CSS file, so that when you make a request for that file, then you don't have to get the additional images as well. It's just they're all encoded directly into the page. And there's various flags you can set. This is obviously effective for small images. For big images, it isn't so effective. So what you can do is you can set specific thresholds in your config file to say if an image is over this size, then just leave the URL reference. Don't encode it. And so, as I said, all of this stuff is done dynamically on the fly. So when this is kind of a trivial example, but say you put a request for module A, and module A declares that it depends on modules B and C. B says it depends on C, D, and E. What's going to happen is that Surf is going to ensure that on the page, if you request A, you get B, C, D, and E loaded onto the page, but it will only include C once, despite it being requested by two different modules. So it's sort of like as soon as something's requested, it's going to be included on the page. So these are the resource goals. So just reiterating what I said. We're trying to get down to a single JavaScript bootstrap resource, a single JavaScript dependency layer, and a single resource of our CSS dependencies. So one of the big overheads in modern web apps, particularly if you're working within your own sort of intranet, is the number of HTTP requests. If you have to make dozens and dozens of HTTP requests, it's actually that over a very fast network. The handshaking, the HTTP handshaking, is actually more of an overhead. So it's better to download less files, and you get improved performance. And actually, the other thing that's going to be coming in, something that we're looking at now, this again is a sort of an accessibility feature, is there's going to be a single image sprite. So whereas before we were base64 encoding images, in terms of accessibility, it's not allowed, or it doesn't meet the criteria to actually have a background image, because you can't set alt text on a background image. So what we're doing as a sort of workaround to that is we have a single transparent background image, and then we have a single image, if you like, and then a background image is applied to that. So we can set the alt text, but that doesn't quite fully meet the accessibility level that we're targeting. So we are going to have an image sprite, which is a sort of a slight compromise to the model, but as I've been saying, accessibility is important to us, so that's the way we're going to go. But that's a future thing for post 4.2. So you're probably thinking to yourself, well, if you're doing all this, this dynamic stuff on the fly, that sounds expensive. Surely any improvements that I was going to get by reducing the number of HTTP requests are going to be offset by the overhead of doing all this analysis in the first place. Well, Surf is now aggressively caching all of these resources. So it caches the following things. It actually caches the dependency tree. So that first time I say I have a I'm using A, and it has to work out that A depends on B and C, that relationship is cached within the model. within Surf. And all the caching is done for the lifetime of the server, and there's actually a control you can actually post and actually to clear the caches if you need to. So we cache the dependency relationships. We also cache the resources themselves. So Surf, one of the cool things about Surf is it can actually hunt out resources from a number of different locations. It can do things from inside jars, for example. It can now, as an additional feature, it can actually load resources directly from the repository if you want it to. So it actually caches the location from where to get a resource, and when it grabs that resource, if you're running in production mode, it will minify it for you on the fly, and it will cache that minified resource. When it pulls all the resources together, it will cache that as well. And your page definitions are cached. So if you have you use the same page definition again, that will be mapped to a resource that will already be cached. And in terms of on the client, because we do a checksum of the contents of those aggregated sources, and we return and that's what's requested, we can set an infinite expiry time on the resource, and then the browser can cache it indefinitely, because if you changed any of the contents, it means that the browser will effectively be having to load a different file and is forced to make another request. So once you hit, obviously the very first time you hit a page, the very first page you hit, there is going to be a little performance overhead, but actually it's not really that noticeable. Subsequent pages are actually going to be much faster. Ideally, we don't want to be hitting the server at all, other than to get the page model for that page. Everything else could be and should be cached on the web client. And obviously this caching is good for migration, things like that. Okay, so I talked about this notion of decoupling. This is the other key thing that we want to get to. We don't want to have widget A having a reference to widget B, because what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to say, actually, you know what, I want to get rid of widget B, I don't want that on the page. And if widget A has a fixed reference to widget B, then you're going to create a break. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to decouple the communication. We want to decouple in terms of data and presentation, and we do that by having this notion of widgets, which are provide presentation, and services, client-side services, which communicate with the back end. And they communicate over a publication subscription model. We also not allow, you can do anything you want, but we have a custom event model, which works very much like bubbling, so like a standard event bubble. So you can actually fire a custom event from a widget, and it will bubble up through its widget's ancestry, and hopefully a widget will, an ancestor will go, yep, I'll deal with that, cancel the event and do something with it. So that kind of thing you could see, for example, when or in the previous session where I was dragging stuff onto the palette and there was a delete button, that delete was saying, hey, delete me. Doesn't specifically say to who needs to be deleted, but the encapsulating layout thing was listening for that particular custom event type and going, yep, okay, I'll deal with that and sort it out. And all of these things, this is done using Dojo, and we actually wrap Dojo. So one of the key things we want to do is we want to avoid tying ourselves to any framework. So we go through our own API, so we can actually change the internals of that API and swap something out if we want to at a later date. So some of you in the room possibly are thinking, hang on, you're not using AngularJS? I had to get Grumpy Cat in there somewhere. I've got nothing against AngularJS per se, but I have seen various things on Twitter and on the community. A lot of people are worried about us using Dojo, and there is a great trend at the moment in web development to say, hey, everything's got to be Angular. And I've got nothing against AngularJS at all. I just want to make that clear. It's very good. It's by Google. Obviously, it's going to be good. But we very much believe in the right tool for the right job. And this didn't particularly tick the boxes we needed. And so why are we going to Dojo? So the key thing, there's quite a lot of key reasons why we picked this framework, and we did look at quite a few, is AMD support. So the only other framework that I'm aware that supports the AMD pattern is Require.js. We could have used Require.js, of course, but Dojo also gives us a lot of other things. So, as I'm going to keep saying quite a lot, it gives you great accessibility. It provides a base widget templating framework, and all of that is geared up around accessibility. It's aiming to meet the WCAG open standards for accessibility. Accessibility is important, and using Dojo and this widget templating gave us a leg up. It gave us a leg up on unit testing, something we hadn't done in the past. We had done some unit testing using the Dojo framework, which is available for Dojo. We're experimenting at the moment, looking at other solutions. Things like we're just evaluating things like Jasmine and Yeti and Intern.io at the moment, trying to work on the best solution for unit testing our widgets. And there were a few things that I saw on Twitter that came up. Some people said, again about you picking Angular, have a healthy community and all this kind of stuff. Well, I'm sit on the Dojo IRC and on the forums, and there is a very good community for it, and it is backed by large players, particularly IBM is one. I do have a soft spot for Dojo, I'll have to admit, because I'm ex-IBM. Despite, again, I'm not saying it's the perfect framework, but it is backed, it has a good community, it is robust, it is enterprise, and as someone else said it was old, but it's actually exactly the same age as Alfresco. It's 8 years old, and I like to think of that as being more mature than new. It's been through a few issues, but it's actually quite a solid platform, and like I said, it ticks a lot of the boxes. But this is the key thing, and if you don't take anything else away, I'd kind of like you to take this away from today. It's not just Dojo. You are not tied to using Dojo at all. The only thing you have to do for your widgets is have a little piece of boilerplate, and actually it's not even really Dojo, it's AMD. And then within that you can do whatever you want. So we have widgets at the moment which wrap the old share UE2 widgets. We have widgets which use UE2 as well. The HTML5 previewer I showed you, if you saw in the previous session, that's all jQuery. We've used other things like the ACE editor, which is just other things you plug in. And one of the great things about using AMD is you can go and grab someone else's library, and if it adheres to AMD, you can just drop it in and use it, and it's really, really simple. And it pulls in all of those things you need. And not only that, it's better than just being AMD, because we're using Surf to basically, we're sort of in control of the whole situation. So we can actually declare dependencies on non-AMD things. We can say, I want this, even though it's not AMD, I can just grab this JavaScript resource and make sure it's on the page. And Surf will make sure those aren't included twice. And as I said, it also pulls in all the CSS. So, it's not just Dojo, it's better than AMD. So that's kind of an idea of what's under the framework. So what have we got? What have we got out of the initially available? So you obviously saw quite a few of them this morning, if you were here. So we've got a whole bunch of menu widgets. So I don't know if this is right, it's not working particularly well. So we've got things like drop-down menus. In the menu bar, it's got menu items. We can group menus, and we can have cascading menus. We can have vertical menus. All this kind of stuff. They're all available. We've also got form widgets, and again, I'm going to stress this quite a bit. It's not just Dojo. We've got, as you can see, if you can see that down the bottom, this is an example of the ACE editor. If you're not familiar with the ACE editor, it allows you to specify MIME types. So if you can read this, it's actually an XML document, puts in the markup, provides validation for you. So all sorts of form widgets. And as I said, the form widgets build. Actually, that was one of the other things I said that again Dojo gives us. It gives us excellent inheritance. So by we've got this base form control, and every time we want to add another form control, what you do is basically extend the default one, and there's a function you override called create widget, and then you just drop in whatever you need, be it a jQuery widget or a UE widget, or you can probably get some Angular in there if you really try. Dead easy to do, and then you get all of this stuff for free via inheritance. We've got layout widgets, again, not just Dojo, because we've got this the UE sidebar stuff we redid with that. So it's hard to really demonstrate layout widgets. We've got all sorts of things like laying out things horizontally, vertically, in like tabs and all sorts of stuff. And we've got a whole suite of document list widgets, or document widgets, I should say, for rendering things like the social stuff, file types, thumbnails, size, date stuff, the actions, all this kind of stuff. These are all available. Most of these, I'll say, they're still at the kind of beta level, as with most of these ones. But they're there, they're coming, we're polishing them up. We've got the HTML5 previewer, which I said is not just Dojo. It's done with jQuery, all very nice. No flash, works in an iPad, swipey with your finger, great stuff. So, we've got all this stuff that's either coming, and there's going to be more along the way. So, where are they? Where are these widgets? So they're in two places. If you're looking in, you're running Tomcat server or whatever you're deploying to. That's the location. Tomcat Web Apps share JS Alfresco. In SVN, it's under Slingshot, which is the code name for share under source web JS Alfresco. And then underneath there, you'll see, like I've got here again, almost I can't read that, and I'm standing right next to it. A whole bunch of the sort of sub packages, if you like. And if you were going to contribute a widget layer, you would put them. You can put them anywhere actually, but the best place to put them would be under share or web/JS, and then put your own package and then have those mapped in. And it's then very easy to share third-party widget libraries around the community. So where are we using this in Share 4.2 at the moment? So actually it's only in one place. We were working on the document library, but we didn't quite get to feature parity in time for 4.2, but it's in the header at the moment. So primarily it's these menu bars, and there's also a search widget as well, and the logo and stuff. So those are really the production-ready items. I know it's not much at the moment, but those are the things that if you did want to use and try out, they're probably the best things to start playing around with. So that's kind of what we have. I know I've just very briefly skimmed over it. If you want to come and find me, I can show you some of the stuff running later on. I wasn't going to do that now. So that's kind of what we've got. So what does this mean for the customization story? Well, really, it's actually very much the same as the story was before. So you want to use the same patterns we were doing before. Primarily, we want to have the extension modules. I talked about this in great length at the DevCons last year, and that video's up on YouTube if you want to refresh your memory. But what you want to be doing is you want to be having custom or targeting the JS controllers, because what will happen is we'll define a default JavaScript controller for a page, and then before that gets passed over to the ProcessJsonModel directive, all of the module JavaScript controllers will get the chance to run, and what that means is they can then actually make changes. So here are some examples of the sort of things you can do. So just imagine this represents a menu bar with 2 menu items in it. What you could do, for example, is that you might a module might want to say, okay, I want to stick another menu item in there. So it can just can stick that in. Or maybe you want to replace one of them completely, so you can delete and replace or change the config and put your own an extended version of a menu item in there. So it's actually really, really easy to do this. It's actually probably the easiest way in which we're providing up until now to do share customization. And you don't really need to understand that much about the widgets themselves. You just need to understand this sort of basic model. And we are trying to provide tooling for doing that. There was an issue, an issue with the delete. We provided basically a find, so an ID, so you could add it, and also provided a widget util for removing. After I wrote this tool, we then found a subsequent bug in Surf, which was to do with processing of sparse arrays. And by fixing the sparse array problem, we actually made the other util not work. And it isn't actually the problem with the util. It's actually there's not enough error checking in the widget, one of the widgets. So this is a problem when extending the header. So I apologise for that, but we will get that fixed. Here's some examples. If you read my blogs, you'll have seen them. I mean, it's a bit subtle, but hopefully you can see that the My Files menu item has been removed. So you can do that kind of thing, removing items. And then this one that's showing up at the moment is an example where we've, now instead of having the drop-down menu by default, you've just got a link to admin page. But this shows where actually I wanted to take that admin menu item and replace it with a drop-down menu. And in that drop-down menu, I wanted to have all, list the specific pages so you can get to something quicker. A few people have actually said they'd actually have preferred that to be in the first place, but hey-ho. And then another example where for the recent sites menu, we've actually changed the site link to be a cascading menu, and then when you click on it, you see the individual site pages, so you can go straight to those. Again, that's just really simple examples of how you can do customization. There are plenty of notes, of blog posts on how to do this and examples to follow, so that's all there, and I will continue to be trying to provide more instruction on how to do that going forward. So a couple of other things that have come in. which is quite interesting. We've introduced this notion of CSS Theme Tokens. So we're always very aware of what's going on out in the sort of web development arena, and a couple of CSS frameworks have sort of caught on, being things like Sass and Less. And one of the things they allow you to do is to do substitution of variables, so that you can sort of do things. It's easier to change your CSS files, or have global variables and then you change it. But again, that's all done at build time. So we've actually introduced the possibility of having defining tokens within your themes and having them mapped into the widget definition. And what this means is, if you define a widget, say this was a CSS file for a widget, we basically using the Sass approach of just having $. So where we've got this $, value, it then refers to a token that you have to define in your theme file. So what this means is we can write all our widgets for all of the themes we have, so we can change the colors and all that kind of stuff. So we don't hard code them into the CSS file. We use the variables, and then it's easier to have have your widgets on a per theme basis. And again, so this is what it would look like in the CSS file. In the XML file for a particular theme, you just list out what it is you want to place. So the token is defined as the element name, and then whatever you want to go is the value. And it doesn't have to be an individual value. It could be entire rules. It could be an entire selector. It could be anything you like. It's always going to get substituted in dynamically by Surf. And as I was saying earlier, Surf caches all of that stuff. So when it builds your CSS file, it doesn't have to do it every time. It has a reference to it. So what's next? So what we're going to do, this is going to be the way in which we start writing new features for Share. So all the new line items we do, we're going to try and work around this. We're going to try and build new widgets, nice atomic, small, fine-grained widgets, and we're going to write them in such a way that they're extendable, and they are reusable, they're properly unit tested, they are fully accessible, and that's kind of what we want to get to. So we want to, as I said, it's a cliche, but we want to work smarter. So we want to do this stuff once and then reuse that work, because quite frankly, we don't have a big enough engineering team in order to meet the demands, and we need to be smarter about how we go about our work. And that lends itself to the community as well. It lends itself to the extensibility and customization story. And probably, I can't say this for certain, but to the best of my knowledge, one of the first things we're going to be looking at is updating the document library, and that's going to be very much done from an accessibility point of view. So we're looking at feature parity with the current document library, but it will be much more, it'll be fully accessible. It'll be using these widgets. And I should say as well that if you've got customizations that use the old document library, you don't really have to worry about it, because the old document library isn't going to go away. It's still going to be there. You may not be familiar. There's a section in, I think it's Share document library config, or it might be Share config, where it actually lists site pages. So if we were to change it to be the new page, you could very easily swap it out to be the old one, and you could just continue it as it was before. But you need to be aware that we're not going to be continuing to work on that old document library. We'd more likely to be working on the new one. So I'm not a product manager. I can't say that for definite, but to the best of my knowledge, that's the sort of the first step we're going to be doing. But there will be other things on the way, but we are getting on board with this approach of writing the UI in this way. So what does this mean for you? So as I said, most of the widgets are very much beta. What I'd like from you guys as a community is to give this stuff a go. And I can never stress this stuff strongly enough. But we sort of throw this stuff out there, and we don't often get feedback, and you've no idea if it's any good or not. If you don't like something, if you don't think it's documented well enough, just tell us about it. Send me tweets, raise things on the forums, email me abuse, whatever you feel gets the job done. But we need the feedback. It needs to be a loop. We need to know if we're doing the right things, if we're solving your problems. So just tell us what you want. But hopefully we're trying to make this better for you. We want to make it easier for you to customize pages. We want to make it easier for you to build new pages. We want you to be able to just grab this thing we have and build something from it, knowing that it's going to work with an Alfresco backend. And also, as well as that, is ideally it will make it easier for the community to work together, to contribute together. It'll be very easy to provide a package, like a jarred up package of your own widgets, and have them shared around the community, and drop those things into an existing share and then start referencing them. So hopefully it's going to be a benefit. That's the only reason why we're doing this stuff. So as I said, the important thing is to get feedback from you, and that's really all I have. Hopefully that's given you a good idea of where we're going with this. So if anyone has any questions, then fire away. As I said, I'm available for engineering hours. I think I'm on later this afternoon and probably tomorrow, but I'll be loitering around in the lobby as well. So if you have any questions or you want to see stuff running, then come and grab me about that. If you've got questions not related to this but to do with customization, existing share stuff, then yeah, come and grab me. But if you've got any questions now as well, then just fire away. Or am I going to get off lightly? Yeah. All right, cool. I think that's it. Thanks very much, everyone.